It was an unusually warm morning in Washington, D.C., with the city bustling as tourists, lobbyists, and government officials filled the streets. George Miller, a seasoned Republican and senior advisor to the president, stepped out of his office, seeking a brief respite before his next meeting. Clad in his signature navy blazer and a crisp white shirt, he was otherwise unassuming, except for one thing that set him apart: his red MAGA hat, perched proudly on his head. The hat wasn't just a piece of apparel for George, it was a symbol of his deep-seated beliefs and unwavering support for the ideals he championed. He wore it occasionally, mostly when he felt the need to remind himself and others of the principles that had guided his career. That morning, he felt particularly emboldened. George's stroll led him to a busy street corner where a street artist had set up an easel, her vibrant paintings drawing a small crowd. As he admired the artwork, taking in the bright splashes of color and the artist's bold brushstrokes, he became aware of a piercing gaze burning into him. The woman staring at him was Sarah Blake, a fiery and passionate activist known for her progressive ideals and vocal criticism of the Republican Party. Sarah, in her late 20s, was a D.C. native who had spent her life fighting for causes she believed in, sometimes through measured dialogue, but more often through confrontational acts of protest. She had been on her way to meet friends when her eyes caught the unmistakable red of George's hat. To Sarah, the MAGA hat wasn't just a symbol of political allegiance. It represented everything she despised about the current administration. Her blood boiled as she approached him, her hands clenched tightly into fists. "Excuse me," Sarah snapped, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter of the street. George turned to face her, his expression calm but curious. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. "Yes, you can help me by explaining why you think it's acceptable to parade around wearing that," she said, pointing accusingly at his hat. George raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. "It's just a hat," he replied evenly. "I'm expressing my views, just as I'm sure you express yours in your own way." "That's not just a hat," Sarah retorted, her voice growing louder. "It's a symbol of oppression, division, and everything wrong with this country." By now, several passers-by had stopped to watch the exchange. Some seemed curious, others uncomfortable, and a few pulled out their phones to record the encounter. George's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Sarah's anger. "You think you can just walk around and flaunt your privilege without facing any consequences?" she continued, her voice laced with contempt. "Miss, I respect your right to disagree with me," George said, his tone steady but firm. "But shouting at someone on the street doesn't bring us closer to understanding each other." Sarah scoffed, her frustration bubbling over. She glanced around and spotted a can of red paint sitting among the street artist's supplies. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, her movements sharp and determined. The crowd gasped as she hurled the paint directly at George. The paint splattered across his chest and face, bright red streaks dripping onto his blazer and staining his shirt. For a moment, there was stunned silence. The street artist shouted in protest at Sarah's use of her supplies, while George remained frozen, his face calm despite the chaos around him. The moment the paint splattered across George Miller's chest, it was as if time stood still. The vibrant red paint, stark against his pristine white shirt and navy blazer, dripped slowly, almost theatrically. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd that had gathered to watch the altercation. George stood motionless for a beat, his expression unreadable. He carefully wiped his face with the back of his hand, revealing streaks of red paint smudged across his cheek. His composure, however, remained intact, a stark contrast to the fiery indignation in Sarah's eyes. "You're going to regret this," a voice murmured from the crowd. It wasn't George who had spoken, but a bystander, a middle-aged man in business attire who recognized him. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, creating an undercurrent of tension. Sarah, however, was undeterred. Her chest heaved as she stepped closer, her face flushed with anger and self-righteousness. "That's for every immigrant you've terrorized," she spat. "For every family torn apart, for every piece of legislation that's hurt people like me. You walk around in that hat as if you're untouchable. Well, not today." George looked at her calmly, his voice measured as he finally broke the silence. "Miss, I understand that you're upset, but resorting to violence, no matter how symbolic, isn't going to fix anything." "Violence?" Sarah laughed bitterly, gesturing to the can of paint she had tossed aside. You think this asterisk is violence? Violence is what your policies have done to millions of people across this country. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some murmured their agreement with Sarah, while others shook their heads in disapproval of her actions. A young man with a smartphone held it high, recording every moment, while an older woman muttered to her friend, "That poor man didn't deserve that." George sighed deeply, resisting the urge to engage in a shouting match. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just a citizen, exercising my right to wear what I choose. That doesn't make me your enemy. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're the enemy of every decent person in this country. Another voice rose from the crowd, this time a younger man in casual clothes. Hey, maybe let the guy talk instead of attacking him. Ever heard of civil discourse? Sarah shot him a glare. Easy for you to say when people like him don't threaten your existence. George raised a hand, signaling for quiet. His movements were deliberate, commanding attention without force. Miss, he began again, his tone firm but not unkind. You don't know anything about me. You don't know my story, my values, or what I've worked for. Yet you've decided I'm the villain. Is that fair? Sarah crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. I know enough. You're a MAGA supporter. That's all anyone needs to know. Just then, a figure emerged from the back of the crowd, a man in his early 40s, wearing a suit and holding a briefcase. His expression was a mix of shock and recognition as he approached George. Excuse me, sir, the man said loudly, addressing the gathering crowd. Do you people even know who this is? The onlookers fell silent, their curiosity piqued. George, however, seemed to sense what was coming and held up a hand. That's not necessary, he said, but the man ignored him. This is George Miller, the man declared, senior advisor to the President of the United States. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Sarah's face went pale, her confidence wavering for the first time. The paint-smeared man she had just berated and humiliated in front of dozens of people wasn't just another MAGA supporter. He was one of the most influential figures in the government. Sarah took a shaky step back, her bravado replaced by visible unease. That can't be true, she stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. It is true, the man confirmed. And you just assaulted him in broad daylight. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Some in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, debating whether Sarah had gone too far. Others pulled out their phones to Google George's name, verifying the man's claim. The realization of what she had done began to sink in for Sarah, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. So what? She said, though her voice cracked. It doesn't change the fact that he represents everything wrong with this country. George looked at her with a mix of disappointment and compassion. And what do you represent, miss? He asked softly. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shutter sound from a bystander's phone camera. Sarah stood rooted in place, her bravado crumbling as the weight of the revelation settled on her shoulders. She had just assaulted one of the most influential figures in the country, someone she had vilified in her mind but never expected to encounter face to face. George Miller remained calm, though the red paint dripping from his face and clothing gave him a surreal appearance. He adjusted his posture, straightened his shoulders, and looked directly at Sarah. I came out here today to clear my head, George began, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. Not to be an object of someone's hatred. You've made a lot of assumptions about me based on what you see on my head. But let me ask you, do you know what I've actually done for this country? Sarah opened her mouth to retort but found no words. Her indignation had burned brightly moments ago, but now it was flickering under the weight of her uncertainty. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and someone whispered, Is he really who they say he is? A middle-aged woman in a floral dress spoke up hesitantly. I've read about him in the news. He's worked on bipartisan efforts to address homelessness, hasn't he? George nodded slightly, acknowledging the woman's comment. That's correct. I've spent the past few years focusing on policies that help the most vulnerable in our society. I've fought for affordable housing, veteran support, and criminal justice reform. Some of those initiatives, believe it or not, were ideas from people across the aisle, people like you." Sarah's face flushed. She looked down at the ground, feeling a pang of embarrassment but clinging to her resentment. "That doesn't excuse everything else. You still stand for asterisk that man asterisk and everything he's done." George let out a quiet sigh. "I don't agree with every policy of this administration, and I don't expect you to agree with me. But throwing paint on someone you've never spoken to, that's not a protest, that's prejudice." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few people nodded. Sarah's fist tightened at her sides. "You don't get to lecture me about prejudice," she said, though her voice wavered. "People like you, your policies, destroy lives." George tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And what do you think you just did here, Miss Blake? Did you build a bridge or burn one?" Her heart skipped a beat. He knew her name. She suddenly realized her notoriety in activist circles must have preceded her, and her actions today would only amplify that reputation, but not in the way she intended. "Wait a minute," one man in the crowd interjected, holding up his phone. "She's Sarah Blake, right? I've seen her videos. Isn't she the one who disrupted that Senate hearing last year?" Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. She had prided herself on her boldness, but now it felt like the crowd was turning against her. Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, she's always pulling these stunts, but this is too far." George raised his hand, silencing the growing chatter. "This isn't about labeling her a villain, it's about showing her and everyone here that we can handle our differences without hatred." Sarah's eyes darted between George and the crowd, her defenses faltering further. I thought you were just another symbol of everything wrong with the world," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." "And if I were just another man on the street?" George asked. "Would that have made your actions justifiable?" She swallowed hard, unable to answer. For the first time, her anger wasn't her shield. It was a mirror, reflecting back at her the consequences of her impulsive actions. The man in the suit who had identified George earlier stepped forward. "Sir, do you want to press charges? What she did, assaulting you in public like this, is a crime." The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. The crowd waited, phones still poised, ready to capture the next chapter of this unfolding drama. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing as she anticipated the fallout. George looked at her, his expression softening. "No," he said after a moment's pause. "Pressing charges won't help anyone. What we need now is understanding, not more division." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. The crowd buzzed with surprise. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping back into the throng. "You're just letting me go?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or ashamed. "I'm giving you a chance to reflect on what happened here," George replied. "We don't grow by tearing each other down, Sarah. We grow by listening, even when it's hard." The crowd was still captivated by the unexpected grace with which George Miller handled the situation. Sarah Blake, standing in the center of it all, felt a weight pressing on her chest, a mix of shame, disbelief, and confusion. She had been so sure of her actions, so sure of her cause. But now, faced with a man who refused to retaliate or condemn her, she was left questioning everything. George took a step closer, his paint-streaked figure commanding attention. He gestured around to the crowd, his voice calm but resonant. "This moment isn't about politics," he said, addressing everyone present. "It's about how we treat one another as human beings. We're all passionate about our beliefs. Sarah here is no different. But when passion turns into hostility, we lose sight of what we're fighting for." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't expect. She had always thought of herself as a champion for justice, someone who fought for those without a voice. But standing there, covered in the consequences of her impulsiveness, she felt small and misguided. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. "Why aren't you angry at me?" George offered a faint smile. "What would anger solve? If I respond to hate with hate, the cycle just continues. I'd rather break it." The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. "We could all learn a thing or two from that," she said softly, nodding in George's direction. George turned back to Sarah, his tone measured and kind. You have a voice, Sarah, a strong one. But how you use it matters. Throwing paint, shouting, humiliating someone, those things don't build the world you want. They tear it apart. Sarah's lips trembled and she lowered her head. I thought I was standing up for what's right, she admitted. But maybe I didn't think about what that really means. That's all any of us can do. Think, listen, and grow, George said. None of us are perfect, but every day we have a choice to act with compassion or with contempt. I hope you'll choose compassion next time. The tension in the crowd began to dissipate, replaced by a quieter, more reflective energy. A few people clapped softly, their applause spreading until it swelled into a show of support, not just for George's words, but for the possibility of change. Sarah wiped her face, streaking some of the paint across her cheek. She looked at George, the tears in her eyes now matched by a hint of determination. I don't know if I can fix what I did, she said, her voice barely audible. But thank you for not giving up on me. George extended his hand, a gesture of goodwill. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took his hand, shaking it firmly. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices echoing through the busy street. The incident quickly went viral. Videos of the exchange flooded social media, sparking intense debate. Some criticized Sarah for her actions, while others praised George for his composure and refusal to escalate the situation. Across political lines, however, there was a surprising consensus. The incident was a powerful reminder of the importance of civility and dialogue. For Sarah, the event was a turning point. She issued a public apology, not just to George, but to anyone she might have hurt with her impulsive actions. She began channeling her passion into constructive activism, organizing events that encouraged open dialogue between people with opposing views. George, for his part, continued his work in the administration, now with a renewed commitment to bridging divides. The paint-stained blazer he wore that day became a symbol of his resilience and his belief in the power of forgiveness. He kept it as a reminder that, even in the face of hostility, kindness can prevail. In the end, what could have been a story of division became a story of reconciliation, a testament to the power of empathy and understanding in a world that so desperately needed it.